Welcome back after a long theory section, which I hope was really helpful. Now in this one, we will basically continue learning about basic JavaScript features and syntax, but this time with a focus on more modern JavaScript. So we're gonna dive deeper into built-in data structures like objects, maps, and arrays. We will talk about modern ES6+ operators such as destructuring and optional chaining, and we will also take a look at how to work with strings. And all this together will then give you a very solid and important foundation for the upcoming sections and projects. Let's start this section by learning about array destructuring. So as I said in the intro video, in this section we're basically going to continue learning basic syntax and basic JavaScript features, but now with a focus on more modern JavaScript. And the theme of this section will be to simulate a food delivery application, and in specific one Italian restaurant, which is this starter data here that we already have in the starter files. And so this one is called Classico Italiano. So I already opened up the starter files here for this project. Okay. Now, learning complex topics like the ones we're gonna dive into in this section is really best done in isolation. This way you can understand exactly what I'm trying to teach you without having to think about 5 other things at the same time. And so I'm isolating just this one restaurant and building no user interface so that we can focus just on the JavaScript language here. And some people will say that this is boring, but believe me, I do have enough teaching experience to know that some topics are best learned in isolation. And for me, the most important thing is that you will actually learn in this course. Now, of course, there are also topics that can be applied to a visual project. And that's why in the next section, we have a really cool project with an amazing user interface where we're going to learn about array methods. But for now, let's focus on built-in data structures and modern advanced operators. And again, starting with array destructuring. So destructuring is an ES6 feature, and it's basically a way of unpacking values from an array or an object into separate variables. So in other words, destructuring is to break a complex data structure down into a smaller data structure like a variable. So for arrays, we use destructuring to retrieve elements from the array and store them into variables in a very easy way. So let's just actually start with a very simple array. And now if we wanted to retrieve each one into its own variable without destructuring, we would do it like this. Let's say we wanted to name them A, B, C. And so we would write the name of the array, which I totally forgot up here. So R0, and then just duplicating this line, which I'm using Command or Option L for. And I'm not sure if that is actually a shortcut in VS Code. Let me see here. And apparently it's not. Let's see here. Duplicate selection. So it's this duplicate selection here. And you can set up a shortcut for that. And so I will just do that. So B, and so that would be element number 1, and number 2 would be C. So that's how we would retrieve these 3 elements. But now with destructuring, we can actually declare all the 3 variables at the same time. So let me show you how. So const, and then we use the square brackets. And so that's because we are destructuring an array. And so now we can declare 3 variables at the same time. And now I'm not using A, B, and C because we already used them. So let's go with X, Y, and Z. And then I will simply set that equal to the array. And that's it. So let's actually see them now in the console. give it a save, and then we need to start our live server with a new terminal. And actually I can hit the tab key now, and it will then automatically write the rest of the command. Then close that down. And as you can see, here we get the two results, 2, 3, and 4. So the elements of the array. So basically, we write this syntax here, and then this will become the first element of the array, this the second, and this the third. And so this here is destructuring this array here from the right side. Okay, and of course, this looks like an array, but it's really not. It's just the destructuring assignment. So whenever JavaScript sees this here on the left side of the equal sign, it knows that it should do destructuring. Now when you do this, just don't forget to actually also declare the variables using const. Okay? And I also wanted to notice that even though we did destructuring, which sounds kind of destructive, right? The original array is of course not affected. Okay, so we are not destroying here the array, we are only destructuring. So we are unpacking it. Okay, and now let's work a little bit with the data from our restaurant. So here we see that we have a couple of arrays here actually. So the categories, the starter menu, and the main menu. So let's take some elements out of the categories. So let's say, and then the destructuring assignment, first and second. All right. And so now you see here that we do not have to take all of the elements out of the array. So this will just take the first and the second. So it will simply follow the order of the elements here and will basically only take these two. And so now the array from which we want to extract, and that's restaurant.categories. Just to take a look now. And indeed, we get Italian and pizzeria, which are exactly the first two elements of the array. But now let's say that we only wanted to take the first category, so this one, and the third. So let's say that this one is the main category and this is the secondary for some reason. Well, to do that, we simply leave a hole in the destructuring operator. So what I mean is just this. And so now the second element will be skipped, so the one that would go here, and then this second here simply becomes this third element. And now, so you see that second now is vegetarian, which is element number 3. All right, and so like this, we don't have to create variables for all the stuff that we might not even need. So if we only need to take this and this, we just skip the element in the middle. Okay, and this is really powerful, and we use destructuring to do a lot of cool things. For example, let's say that the owner of the restaurant now decided to switch the main and the secondary category. So right now the primary is Italian and the secondary is vegetarian, but now they wanted to switch it. So let's first change the name here to main and secondary, just to make it a bit more obvious. Secondary. And so if we would like to switch these two variables, then without destructuring, we would have to do it like this. We would need to create a temporary variable, and then to that we would assign one of them. So let's say main, and then we could switch main. We would say main is equal to the secondary, and then secondary is equal to temp, because that's where we temporarily stored the value of main, right? We could not just do main equals secondary and then secondary equals main, because by then we would already have overwritten the main variable, right? And that's why we need this temporary variable in the middle. So that's how we would do it. But with destructuring, we can make it a lot easier. And this is how we do it. First, we create an array with both of them. And the first one is going to be the secondary. And then the second one will be the main. And actually, before we do that, let me just show you that this worked. So main and secondary. And so now we should see them switched. Oh, okay. Here we need to change, of course, to let, because we are reassigning here to a const in line 24. So let's try that now. And indeed, what was Italian is now vegetarian, and what was vegetarian is now Italian. So this here worked indeed, but let's now take this out so that we can do it using destructuring. So as I was saying, in order to switch the two variables using destructuring, we would first start by creating a new array with the two variables inverted. So first secondary and then main, and then we can simply destruct them. So main and secondary equals the destructuring of this array. And now we're not using let or const here, because we are simply reassigning the values of the two variables. So just like we did here. But now we do not need a temporary variable in the middle. So let's check now. And indeed, the result is the same. But this is a lot easier. And this is a trick here that I actually use all the time. So let me just show here, or actually write here, switching variables. Okay, so that's a pretty cool trick. And another trick with destructuring is that we can have a function return an array, and then we can immediately destruct the result into different variables. And so this basically allows us to return multiple values from a function. And so let's try that and write a function to order food. So here in our restaurant, let's now add a method, and I'm going to call it order. So this will be a function, and it will accept two parameters. One index for the starter menu, so this menu, and then one index for the main menu. And then the person will order basically by giving the index for each of the menus. So something very simple, just to illustrate the point here. So let's say starter index and main index. Okay, and so we will simply now return the content of the arrays based on the given indexes. So return. And so as I said, we're going to return an array. And then we go to this dot starter menu. Okay. And remember how the this keyword here is set, as we learned in the last section. And so now we go to the position of the starter index that we passed into the function. Okay, that makes sense. Then the same with the main menu at the position of the main index that is passed in. All right. So here we are, of course, not doing any destructuring yet, but now is the time where we will do it. So let's call order, or in fact, restaurant.order, and let's use 2 and 0. So we want element number 2 from the starter menu, so the garlic bread, and the number 0 from the main menu, which is pizza. So we're going to receive an array with that, right? Let me just show that to you. And indeed, it is garlic bread and pizza. And so now we can simply destructure that. So this is the destructuring assignment. And so let's say starter and main should equal these two results. So let's log them, starter and main. Oh, and now this was already defined before. So let's just call this one here the main course. And now indeed we get garlic bread and pizza. All right, so this is how we basically receive two return values from a function. All right, so of course we could have done that without destructuring and still return an array from the function, but this is a very handy way of then immediately creating two variables out of one function call. Okay, and now that you understand how destructuring works, let's take it one step further. Because what happens if we have a nested array? So let's say nested. And with nested, we mean one array inside another. So let's say that we now here have another array, 5 and 6. So an array inside an array. And I'm not sure if we did that before, but of course that's perfectly acceptable. So as a small exercise, how can we get this value here and this entire array? Well, we simply define two new variables using the destructuring assignment. Let's call them I and j. And remember that we do not want in the middle. So we just skip it. So simply leave a space and then another comma, and then this one is going to be j equals to the array from which they should be taken. And indeed, we get the number 2 and then the array 5 and 6. Great, but what if we actually wanted all the individual values? Well, then we would essentially have to do destructuring inside of destructuring. So that sounds complicated, but it's not. So let's take out these here, and let's create now 3 variables. So one for this, one for the 5, and one for the 6. So we're going to skip the 4 again. So that's going to be I, then again the whole here, and now here we can destruct this inner array immediately. So we use the destructuring here again, and so now j for the first element and k for the second. So for 5 and 6. And then again, the array from which to take. And then let's take a look. And so this should now give us 2, 5, and 6 as separate variables. And yes. So that's how nested destructuring works. Basically, we need to do destructuring inside of destructuring. Okay, and now to finish, there's just another feature of destructuring that I want to show you. So we can also set default values for the variables when we are extracting them. And that's going to be very useful in the case that we don't know the length of the array. And this can sometimes happen in real-world applications, as you will see later. So if we have an array that is shorter than we might think, then we might try to unpack the array in positions that don't even exist. So let me say here just default values, and here nested destructuring. So learning a lot of stuff here about destructuring. And so let's now say that we have this array, 8 and 9, and then we are trying to destructure it. So just pretend that we actually don't know the array, all right? And so we might try to take 3 elements out of the array using, again, destructuring. So let's call them P, Q, and R. And then let's try to log them all, P, Q, and R. And so now here we get undefined as the third one. So this would basically be the same as trying to read the element at position number 2 of this array. But it only has elements at position 0 and 1. And so therefore we then get undefined. But as I said, we can set default values. So let's simply set them all to 1. And then, or R will become 1. Great. And if we remove this element, then Q will also become 1. Okay? And as I said, this can sometimes be useful, for example, when we get data from an API. And so we're gonna probably use this one and actually everything that we did in this lecture a bit later in the course. So we talked about destructuring arrays, but we can also destructure objects. So let's do that now. And this time, let's actually write the code before the previous lecture. So right here after this restaurant object, so that we don't have to scroll too much. Also, I added this object here to the restaurant object. And so that was already in your starter files, but I didn't have it here yet. Anyway, let's now talk about object destructuring. And so to do that, we use the curly braces to destructure. So to destructure objects, we use the curly braces, because this is also how we create objects, right? Then all we have to do is to provide the variable names that exactly match the property names that we want to retrieve from the object. So the obvious choice here of object to destructure is restaurant. So let's take the name, categories, and opening hours. So again, let's start with const in order to actually define some variable names. And now, as I said, we need to write the exact property names here to now extract variables from this object. Now, since in an object the order of elements does not matter, we don't need to manually skip elements like we did in an array. So we can simply write name, so that's the restaurant name here, and then also remember that in objects the order of the elements does not matter. And so we can also then take now the opening hours, which is kind of the last property, and only then the categories. And then we simply say equal restaurant. So that's exactly the same as with arrays. But now here we use the curly braces and we have to specify the name of the properties. But just like with arrays, this now creates 3 brand new variables. So based on this restaurant object. So let's see. Name, opening hours, and categories. And indeed, here they are. Okay. So that's the fundamentals of destructuring objects. And once again, this is an extremely useful addition to the language, especially when we deal with the result of an API call, which basically means to get data from another web application like weather data or data about movies or something like that. And this data usually comes in the form of objects, basically. And then destructuring is really a lifesaver. It allows us to write a lot less code. So this is really used in modern applications. But now, what if we wanted the variable names to be different from the property names? Well, we can do it like this. Now, of course, we still need to reference the property names like we did before. Otherwise, JavaScript has no way of knowing what we actually want. So let's write name again, but then we can use the colon and specify a new name. Let's say we actually want it to be called restaurant name. And then here, let's say we want the opening hours, but we want the variable to be called just hours. And then once again, we want to take the categories, but we want the variable name to be called tags. And then again, equal to restaurant. And so the variables that we now created are called restaurant name, hours, and tags. So basically this, and this. And VS Code is nice enough to put them in this purple color here too. And so you see that these 3 are actually the exact same name, but we were able to give them new variable names, which again is going to be immensely helpful when dealing with third-party data. And another useful feature for when we are dealing with third-party data like that, so like an object that we get from somewhere else, for example, an API call, as I was just explaining, it can be really useful to have default values for the case that we're trying to read a property that does not exist on the object. So usually then we get an undefined. For example, if we were trying to say restaurant.menu, this would be undefined because there is no property called menu. We have starter menu and main menu, but not just menu. Okay, and so we can set default values just like we can actually in arrays. So let's say that we are trying to destructuring the menu, and so we use equal to set a default value. All right, and then we can do the same with the starter menu, for example, and then we can even combine this syntax here with what we did previously. So let me show you. So let's say that we're trying to retrieve the starter menu. So this one, but we then want to give it another name. So starter menu, and we want to call it just starters. And we also want to give it a default value in case it doesn't exist. So in this case, just an empty array. Now in this case, it actually does exist. So starter menu does exist. And so therefore this default value will not apply, but it should apply to menu. Because as I was just saying, there is no property on the restaurant object called menu. So menu and starters. And so here indeed we get the default value, which is the empty array. And here we get the starter menu. And without this, we would then get undefined, as I was saying. You see? And so this is a nice way of setting a default value. And once again, keep in mind that this is especially helpful when we do not have our data hard-coded like we have it here. So this is just hard-coded data in our application, but in the real world, we usually get the data from somewhere else. And then we might not always know how exactly the data looks like. And so then it's useful to set defaults like this. Next up, we need to talk about mutating variables while destructuring objects. So we did that before with arrays when we were switching variables. Remember that? So let's see. Down here, you see that we mutated these variables that we created before. But with objects, it works a little bit differently. And so let's write that here. Mutating variables. And here let's write default values. So let's say that we already have some variables here. So A and B. And then we have this object, which has a property A of 23, property B of 7, and C of 14, let's say. All right. And now we want to destructure this object. And actually, let's first store it into a variable. That makes it a bit easier to work with it. And so now actually let us destructure this array. Now we cannot say const like A, B, because A and B are already declared up here, right? We can also not do let, because again, that would create new variables and we already have them there. Okay, so here we are missing the object that we are destructuring. But as I was saying, we cannot do this. And so in fact, we want to mutate these variables. So A should become 23 and B should become 7. But now as we save this, watch what happens. And so we get a syntax error. And the reason for that is that when we start a line with a curly brace like this, then JavaScript expects a code block, all right? And since we cannot assign anything to a code block like we did here with the equal sign, then we get this error unexpected token with the equal there. So to solve this here, the trick is to wrap all of this into parentheses. And so that's the thing that I wanted to show you here. Okay, so now if we log A and B, it will work. So you see, now we get 23 and 7. So basically we did overwrite these two initial variables, but in order to do it, we had to wrap this destructuring assignment into parentheses. All right, and now we already know how object destructuring works, and so now we need to talk about nested objects, just like we did with nested arrays. So let's say we wanted to create two variables, open and close. And these should contain the open and close hours for Friday. Okay, so you see that opening hours is an object, and then in that object, we have another object. So this Friday is an object inside an object, which itself is inside the restaurant object. Okay, now the opening hours is already an object here that we have already stored in a variable. So that's the object that we're going to destructure. So nested objects. So again, we're going to start with opening hours, and now we want to retrieve Saturday. So let's start with doing that. So just Saturday for now. Or actually Friday. So I think I said Friday. So let's see. And so indeed, Friday is this object that we get here. But remember that we actually want two variables, one called open and the other one called close. And this is how that works. So we know that this is an object, and now we can further destructure that object using this syntax. So the colon, and then again the exact property name of that inner object. Okay, so that looks confusing, but that's just the syntax that we have to use. So maybe you don't even need to memorize this, but when you need this someday, and you will, then you can just come to this video and see how it works. And so indeed, now we get our numbers 11 and 23. And we could, of course, take this even further and even assign different variables to these, just like we did up here. So with the colon again. So we could call this one just O, and this one just C. So this is taking it to an extreme. But as I said in the beginning, destructuring is really powerful. So there's a lot of stuff we can do with it, and that's why I'm showing you all of it right now. Okay, and now to finish, let me actually show you a really cool practical application of this destructuring. And for that, we're going to go back to our object here. So to our example of this section, and now we will create another method. So many times in JavaScript, we have functions with a lot of parameters. And then it can be hard to know the order of parameters for someone that is using this function. And so instead of defining the parameters manually, we can just pass an object into the function as an argument, and the function will then immediately destructure that object. So let me show you what I mean. And let's say we want an order delivery. So that's a new function. Okay. And so here, let's just for now call this argument object. And then I will log that object to the console here. And now let me call this actually. And I will do it right here so that we can see everything at the same time. So that is restaurant.orderDelivery. And now here comes that object of options. So as I said, we can now specify some options here. Let's say the time of delivery. Let's set it to 23:30, which is like 10:30 p.m. Let's also say address Via del Sole 21. And then we also specify the main index and the start index. So a little bit like we did up here in this function, starter index. Okay. Oh, and here we need to also give it some value. Let's just say 2 as well. And so, yeah, here right at the beginning is that object that we just defined, because here we are simply logging it for now, okay? So what we just did was to call this function here and passing in an object of options. And that's a pretty standard thing actually in JavaScript, especially in third-party libraries. Because now, here in the function arguments, we can actually do destructuring right away. So we can now say starter index, main index, time, and address, which is exactly the 4 property names that we have down here. And of course, usually we would first develop the function and then call it, but I wanted to explain you this way of calling a method with an object so that writing the object here then makes sense. All right, and so now instead of the object, since we did the structuring right here, we now actually have 4 variable names. So we can log them to the console, or actually let's do some nice string here. So let's say order received. And then let's get the food. So based on the starter index, let's just copy that from here. So this dot starter menu at the current starter index, and then also the main menu. So let's again copy that, actually all of this from here. And we need the curly braces and this $sign will be delivered to, then the address, and then the time. Okay. And so indeed, we get this complete string based on the data that we passed in this single object. Okay. So that's important to realize. We only passed in one object into this function. Okay. We did not pass 4 arguments. It's really just one argument, one object. Then here in the function, as we receive that object, we do immediately destructuring. And so that's why these names here need to be exactly the names that we have down here in the object. But what's great about this is that here the properties in the index don't have to match the order in which we do destructuring up here. And so that makes it really easy for the user of this function to specify basically the arguments. All right. So this is great, but we can even use some more knowledge that we gained here, which is these default values. So we can now use this to basically set defaults here on some of these. So let's say that the starter index will be 1 if it cannot be destructured, and that the main index will be 0 and the time will be 20 hours. And so now as we call this method, restaurant.orderDelivery, I can specify the address again. Let's actually copy it from here. And let me also just specify the starter index. Okay, but then the rest will be taken from the default values that we set here for destructuring. All right, and so here as a second string, we get will be delivered to Via del Sole at 20 hours. Okay, so in this object that we passed, we do not have any property for the time, right? And so then as JavaScript did destructuring, it here took the default value of 20. Okay, and the same happened for the main index that we also did define. So it shows 0, and 0 is pizza, and that's why we get pizza here in the output string. All right. So if you ever need to write a function like this, so a really complex one with a lot of parameters that might be then hard to specify, keep this technique in mind. And this becomes even more useful as the amount of parameters increases. Let's now talk about the amazing spread operator. So we can use the spread operator to basically expand an array into all its elements. So basically unpacking all the array elements at 1. So let's say that we have an array. So 7, 8, and 9. And now we want to create a new array based on this array, but with some new elements at the beginning. So how would we do that? Well, with what we already know, we would need to loop over this array, or even worse, do it like manually. For example, like this. Let's call it the bad new array. So if we wanted to add 1 and 2 to the beginning of this array, we would have to write 1, 2, and then each of these elements, right? So that would be R0, R1, and R2. Okay, let's take a look. And now indeed we get a new array with the 3 original elements and then a 1, 2 at the beginning of that array. Okay, and this is actually quite a common operation that we need to do. And so we can now, since ES6, do it in a much better way using the spread operator. So with the spread operator, it's going to work like this. So let's create a new array. So this is the good, let's say, new array. And then again, we use 1, 2, and then we use the spread operator, which is ... to basically expand this array into all of its individual elements. So let's see the result, and then I will explain it a little bit better. So new array, and you see that we get the exact same result here. So what the spread operator does is to basically take all the values out of this R array and then write them individually as if we wrote 7, 8, 9 here manually. All right. So if we wrote it without these 3 dots, then we would have this array, so this R array inside of this one. So just like this. So 1, 2, and then an array of 7, 8, 9. And that's because here we are including this entire array. But with the spread operator, again, it's like taking all the elements out of the array and writing them here manually. And so when we do this, we then get 7, 8, 9 individually here represented in this new array. So what this means is that we can use the spread operator whenever we would otherwise write multiple values separated by commas. And that situation happens whenever we write an array literal like we did up here. So that's the first situation in which it's very useful to expand an array. And the second situation is when we pass arguments into functions. So for example, let's say that we wanted to actually log the individual elements of this new array here. So if we simply logged the array, then it's of course going to look like this. It's just one value, which is the array. It's just one big value. But if we use the spread operator to expand the new array, then see what happens then. So now it logged the individual elements of the array. So this would be the same as writing 1, 2, 7, 8, 9 individually. So once again, whenever we need the elements of an array individually, then we can use the spread operator. And that is useful when we write an array and when we need to pass multiple elements into a function like we did here. All right, so let's see a bit more useful example. So in this example, we will create an array with one more food item in the main menu array. So that main menu is here at restaurant.mainMenu. And so basically we want to create a new menu here. So const new menu. And then let's say that we want the original array plus one new element. So we can do that by simply expanding the array. So that's restaurant.main menu. And then we can add other stuff. So let's say gnocchi, I think, at least that's how I think it's spelled or pronounced in Italian. And so let's have a look at our new menu. And indeed, it has the 3 original elements plus the gnocchi. And keep in mind that here we are indeed creating a completely new array. All right. We are, of course, not manipulating the restaurant.main menu array. So we are building a new array from scratch. And you can see that here by these square brackets. So this brackets syntax here is simply the way in which we have always been writing new arrays. And so here, again, we are writing a new array, but simply based on expanding this array and then adding another element to it. Okay. Now, you might have noticed that the spread operator is actually a bit similar to destructuring, because it also helps us get elements out of arrays, right? Now, the big difference is that the spread operator takes all the elements from the array, and it also doesn't create new variables. And as a consequence, we can only use it in places where we would otherwise write values separated by commas. And in case you're taking notes, probably what I just said would be very helpful to have as a note. Next, let's learn about 2 important use cases of the spread operator, which is to create shallow copies of arrays and to merge 2 arrays together. So let's say copy array. And so let's simply create a copy of the main menu. So main menu copy. And so let's write a new array. And into that new array, we will put all the elements that are currently in the main menu. So add restaurant.main menu, and that's it. So here we just created a shallow copy of this array. So that's a little bit similar to object.assign that we used in the previous section. Okay, but here this syntax is actually a lot easier to use. Now to join 2 arrays together, so join 2 arrays or more, of course, we can use the same technique. And so maybe at this point you can already guess how that would work. And so you can do this actually as a challenge. So pause the video right now and create this variable menu, which will be an array which contains the whole menu. So both the main menu and the starter menu. So take a minute and try it on your own here. All right, so hopefully you managed to do that. And so the secret here, again, is to use the spread operator. So restaurant, and let's start with the starter menu. So that's going to be our first couple of elements in this new array. And then, of course, we can use the spread operator again. And then this time expand the main menu. .main menu. And so now we end up with an array containing all the food items that are both in the starter and the main menu. And again, because here with this spread operator, we took all the elements out of the starter menu and basically wrote them here into this new array, and then the same with the main menu. All right, so I told you that the spread operator works on arrays, but that's not entirely true, because actually the spread operator works on all so-called iterables. Now, what is an iterable? Well, there are different iterables in JavaScript, and we will talk about all of them by the end of the course. But for now, just know that iterables are things like all arrays, strings, maps, or sets, but not objects. So basically, most of the built-in data structures in JavaScript are now iterables, but except objects. So let me actually write that here for you. Iterables are arrays, strings, maps and sets, but not objects. Now, anyway, since strings are also iterables, that means that we can use the spread operator on a string as well. So let me quickly show that to you. So let's just create a quick string here, Jonas. And then I want to create an array which contains all the individual letters and plus some other elements. So let's call this one letters. And then we create a new array and expand the string here as well. Then here I want an empty string, and then here I want an S. And now let's log it to the console, and then it will make a little bit more sense. All right. And so indeed, here we get this array where each letter of the original string is now an individual element. So just like we expanded, so we unpacked an array, we now did the same thing with a string. Now just keep in mind that we can still only use the spread operator when building an array or when we pass values into a function. So for example, we can also do this. So expand the string here, and so then it is the same thing as writing this. So J, O, and so on and so forth, right? So indeed, here now we get all the individual elements. All right. So for example, what we can do is to use this to build a string using a template literal. So here, this is not going to work. And that's because this is not a place that expects multiple values separated by a comma. So you see unexpected token. All right. So again, multiple values separated by a comma are usually only expected when we pass arguments into a function or when we build a new array. So take note of that, because that is important to understand about the spread operator. Okay, but now enough with building arrays. Let's now actually write our own function that accepts multiple arguments and then use the spread operator to actually pass those arguments. And so that's going to be a very real life example right there. So let's add here another method now. And so let's say that we want a method to order just pasta, okay? And the pasta always needs to have exactly 3 ingredients. So let's say order pasta, and it's going to be a function. And so now here we need 3 ingredients. So let's just call them inc1, inc2, and inc3. And then just log them to the console or some string. Here is your delicious pasta with, so inc1, inc2, and inc3. So up here we have an error. So this should be number 3. And then let's now call this function. So order pasta. Now what I want to do here is to actually get these ingredients from a prompt window. So remember the prompt function that we can use. And so let's create an array called ingredients. Ingredients. And each element here will be defined by a prompt window. So this here now has nothing to do with the spread operator. It's just a way so that we can actually input the data ourselves. So let's say, and here we need to escape this. So let's make pasta. Ingredient 1. And I think I didn't show you this escaping here before. So here, when we simply write this single quote here to write let's, JavaScript thinks that we are finishing this string here. Okay, and so we could use the double quotes out here, or we can escape using the backslash. Okay, now when we save this, I think that Prettier will actually get rid of this here. but it's still important to know that escaping exists. So basically this masks this single quote here so that it does not finish the string at this point. So let's save it. And so you see that now the prettier extension actually replaced the single quote with the double quote. And so here we see our prompt already, but let's create two more. So let's say ingredient 2 now, and then another one. So again, here we are simply building an array of the 3 ingredients. Okay, and then we can log it to the console. So just to see A, B, and C. And so indeed, we now get this array ingredients with A, B, and C, which are the 3 strings that we just wrote there. And now, how should we actually call the order pasta function? So restaurant.order pasta. And in the old way, we would now write ingredients 0, ingredients 1, and ingredients 2, right? But since we learned about the spread operator in this lecture, we can now do a lot better. And so instead, we do this. Restaurant.order pasta. And now all we need to do is to expand the elements of the ingredient array. And that will then basically write the 3 elements of the array here separated by commas. So this and this should yield the exact same result. And so let's now test it out with some real data. So let's see, mushrooms, asparagus, and cheese. And so indeed we get now twice, here is your delicious pasta with mushrooms, asparagus, and cheese. And what do you think is the better solution? This one or this one? And especially considering that an array could of course be a lot longer than just 3 elements. So indeed, always go with this more modern ES6 syntax here. It's an amazing addition to the language. And now just to finish this lecture here, since ES 2018, the spread operator actually also works on objects, even though objects are not iterables. So let's write that here. And here let's just write a real world example. And so let's now experiment with this. The first example here was to create a new array based on one initial array, right? And so let's now also create a new restaurant object with all the data from the original one plus some additional data. And so this is actually an amazing way of doing this because it's so much easier than with old JavaScript. So let's call this one new restaurant. And then we can simply spread the old restaurant, and this will then basically copy all the properties of the restaurant into this new object. And then we can add anything that we want. Founder, for example, let's say Giuseppe or Giuseppe, I don't really know how to say it. And of course here the order does not matter as always. So this spread here doesn't even have to be the first one. So let's say we also want the founding year, let's say 1998. Okay, and so with this we created a brand new object. Now we need to get rid of these 3 prompts there because otherwise it's gonna drive us crazy. So let's just take this out and simply log here the new restaurant to the console. And so indeed we get our original object basically plus the founder and plus founded in. Great. And finally, since we were able to do shallow copies of arrays using the spread operator, we can do the same with objects. So instead of using object.assign as we did it in the previous lecture. So let's do that. Restaurant copy. And so all we need to do is an empty object, and then in there expand all the elements of the original object, so the restaurant in this case. And so now if we attempt to change something on the copy dot name, let's call it now ristorante Roma. And if you're Italian, you're not gonna like how that sounds. But anyway, now as we take a look at both of them, so the name of the copy and the original, now you will see that they are different. So the copy has the name of Ristorante Roma, and the old one has Classico Italiano, which means that indeed we did make a copy of the original restaurant, because otherwise, as we learned by the end of the previous section, changing one object would then also change the other one, right? Cool. So another long lecture here, but we're making really great progress. And of course, we will use all this in real projects later down the road. But again, I chose to teach you these concepts in a separate way and not inside a big project, because this allows me to show you a lot more different examples, and it also makes the material more referenceable for you in the future. And so that's going to be helpful when you're trying to find what you're looking for after taking this course. Moving on, let's now talk about the REST pattern and also REST parameters. And the REST pattern looks exactly like the spread operator. So it has the same syntax with the 3 dots, but it actually does the opposite of the spread operator. Now that doesn't seem to make much sense, right? But let me explain. So remember that we used the spread operator to build new arrays or to pass multiple values into a function. So those are the 2 use cases of the spread operator. And in both cases, we use the spread operator to expand an array into individual elements. Now the REST pattern uses the exact same syntax, however, to collect multiple elements and condense them into an array. So that's really the opposite of spread. The spread operator is to unpack an array, while REST is to pack elements into an array. And since that sounds really confusing, let's write some code. And let's start by exploring the use case of building arrays. So just to recap, in the last lecture, we used the spread array like this. So we wanted to create a new array based on an existing array. And so we used the spread operator to expand that. So here we are still using the spread syntax. And we know that this is the spread syntax because we are using it on the right-hand side of the assignment operator, so of the equal sign. So let me actually write that here. Spread, because on the right side of the assignment operator. However, we can also use it on the left-hand side of the assignment operator together with destructuring. So now we're mixing kind of everything together here, but bear with me here. So let's say that we are destructuring this array. So let me first write the array here, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so let's say I want to take the first element, store it in variable A, the second element to store in variable B, and now I can here use the REST pattern. So the same syntax, and now let's call this others. And so here it is the REST syntax because it's on the left-hand side of the assignment operator. First write that and then see the result, because on left side of the equal sign. And so now let's log A, B, and the others, whatever that's gonna be. And so 1, 2, and then basically the rest of the elements that we did not select into the A and the B variables. So what is happening here? Well, just like before, the first and the second elements become this first and second variables. But then here comes the rest pattern. And so it's called rest because it will take the rest of the elements, so the remaining elements of the array, and then put them into a new array. And in this case, we call this array others. So as I said in the beginning, the rest pattern basically collects the elements that are unused in the destructuring assignment. So let's see another example here. And this will show you that we can actually use the 3 dots on both sides of the assignment operator. So let's say that we have this array, which will be the entire menu. And so we already know how to build that using the spread operator. So we go to restaurant.mainMenu. So that's dot. So we take all the elements out of that array and put it into a new array. And then into this new array, we also put the starter menu. Okay, so this is going to be an array, a big array with all the entire menu. But now we can actually also use the rest pattern here. And so again, we do that here on the left-hand side while we are doing destructuring. So let's take a look here at the main menu. So let's say that we want to take the pizza and the risotto. Okay, so that's the first and the third. So let's create a variable called pizza. Then we can skip one variable, remember, so leaving a hole there in the destructuring assignment. Then let's call one variable risotto, and then simply put all the other food, well, into an array called other food. And now let's simply log everything here to the console. All right, so we get indeed the string pizza, the string risotto, and then all the rest of the elements that we didn't select previously into their own variables. And note here that the rest syntax collects all the array elements after the last variable. So in this case here, risotto. So it does not include any skipped elements. So it's really just the rest of the elements. And yeah, again, as I said, it does not include any skipped elements. And so for that reason, the rest pattern always must be the last in the destructuring assignment, because otherwise, how will JavaScript know until when it should collect the rest of the array, right? So for example, we could not do this. So the error message is actually very explicit. So the rest element must be the last element. All right. And also for the same reason, there can only ever be one rest in any destructuring assignment. Okay. And now let's do the same in objects, because it also works indeed in objects. So the difference then, of course, is that the remaining elements will be collected into a new object and not into a new array. So let's now work here with our opening hours. And let's say that we want to select only Saturday here. And then the rest should go into a new object, which are the weekdays. So Saturday is weekend, and Friday and Thursday are the weekdays. And so basically we want to create an object only with these two. So only for the weekdays. And now that is easy to do. All we need to do is to basically take out Saturday into its own variable, and then we simply collect the rest into a new object. And this we can call weekdays. Okay? And then here, of course, the object that we are destructuring. Dot opening hours. And now let's take a look at our weekdays here. And indeed, it is exactly what we were expecting. It is an object only containing Friday and Thursday. And again, that's because we already took Saturday into its own variable before. And so this then collected the rest of the properties into its own new object. Great. So now we know how the REST pattern works to collect elements in a destructuring assignment. And actually, let's write that here. So this whole first part is for destructuring. And then the second part will be about functions, basically. So remember that also for the spread operator, the second use case was to pass multiple arguments into a function all at the same time. So that's exactly what we did here in our real example with this ingredients array, right? So we had an array, and then we expanded all of these elements of the array to basically pass these elements then as individual arguments of the function. And so now, as you can guess, the REST operator can basically do the opposite. And so let's now write an example function for that. So I'm going to call it add. And so in a real adding function, we want to take an arbitrary amount of arguments and simply add all of them together, right? So function, and for now, let's just leave it like this. And so let me illustrate how we want to call this function actually. So we want to be able to do, for example, this 2 and 3. It should give us 5. But then we also might want to be able to do this 5 and 3 and 7 and 2, for example. So again, any arbitrary amount of arguments should work for this function. So something like this, for example. But of course, we're not going to specify like 7 arguments here, right? So how can we do that? Well, we will use the REST pattern. And in this case, it is actually called REST parameters. So let's use the REST syntax, and then let's call this argument numbers. And here, let's then log this numbers to the console. So this function is going to be called 3 times. And so we are expecting 3 results here. And what we see here is 3 arrays with all the arguments that we passed into the functions. But they are indeed arrays. And so now, once again, as I said in the beginning, the REST syntax is taking multiple numbers or multiple values and then packs them all into one array. So once more, it is doing the opposite of the spread operator. So with the spread operator, we expand. With the REST syntax, we compress. So here it's called REST arguments. Okay? And now we can write some simple logic here to actually add all the numbers together. I believe we already did that. So here is our sum variable that's going to be accumulating. Then let's write a simple for loop. And you could also do this here as a challenge if you wanted. But anyway, I will just do it right away. So we know that numbers is an array, and so we can take the length of that array and run this loop as long as the counter is below the length of the array. And in each iteration, we simply add the current number to the current sum value, basically. So I'm writing this really fast because we already did this before. All right. And so this should be nothing new at this point. And now to finish, we can log this sum to the console to get some results. And indeed, this here is now 5. And so this is at this point a working function which can accept any number of parameters. And hopefully you're not confused yet by this. And now I want to take it even to the next level. So let's create yet another array. Let's just call it X because it's not important. And I will put in numbers 23 and let's say 5 and 7. So now if we wanted to take these values here and call the add function with these 3 values, how would we do that? Well, simple enough. we simply use the spread operator. And that's it. And so this is exactly what we learned in the previous lecture. So we're taking all the numbers of the array and spreading them here. And so this would be the same as writing manually 23, 5, and 7. And so this is a good example of showing you how spread is the opposite of rest. Because after these numbers being spread here, they will then enter this add function here, and then they will immediately be collected into this numbers array by the rest parameters. Okay? So here we unpack the values, and here we pack them back again into an array. And you could actually be wondering why we are not simply writing an add function which takes an array as an argument, and then we don't need all of this. Well, it's way better to do it like this, because then the function can accept both an array, basically by doing this, and simply all the single values, like this. And also it feels a little bit more natural to simply pass as many arguments as we want to add together into the function. So without having to deal with arrays if we don't want to. And so this rest parameters is something that you will see all the time in modern JavaScript code bases. Okay, and now just to finish this, let's actually use rest parameters in our restaurant example here, also to see some edge cases. So let's add yet another method here. And this time the method is going to be about ordering pizza. So order pizza. And now pizzas need to have at least one ingredient, but the other ingredients are optional. And for this, rest parameters are perfect. So let's say main ingredient, and then the other ingredients. And so now this is going to work a little bit like this structuring again, where then this here basically will collect all of the rest of the arguments into an array. So let's see that. So main ingredient, and let's log the other ingredients. Okay, and so now let's order pizza. So restaurant.order pizza. And now here we specify our ingredients. So let's say mushrooms, onion, olives, and spinach. So nice vegetarian pizza right here. And so you see, we can specify as many arguments as we wanted. Let's save this. And you see down here immediately that we get mushrooms, which is this first ingredient here. And then we get an array of all the remaining ingredients that we passed in. And so this, of course, is the result of the rest arguments. So again, the first argument was stored into this main argument here. And then all the remaining arguments that were passed in were simply stored into this array by the rest parameter syntax. Okay. And of course, we could also simply define just one. So let's order now a pizza with only mushrooms. Then the remaining arguments here will simply be put in an empty array because, of course, there are none. And so there's nothing to collect into the array, but we still get an empty array that we can work with if we want. So in that function, we could now create some logic, like to create a string based on all of these ingredients, but I'm not going to go into that right now. But if you want to have some fun, then feel, of course, free to do that by yourself. Anyway, the takeaway from this example is that, once again, the rest parameters serves to collect all of the remaining, basically unused parameters that were not used in this parameter. All right, so let's recap after yet another quite long lecture here. So the spread and the REST syntax both look exactly the same, but they work in opposite ways depending on where they are used. So the spread operator is used where we would otherwise write values separated by a comma. On the other hand, the REST pattern is basically used where we would otherwise write variable names separated by commas. So again, the REST pattern can be used where we would write variable names separated by commas and not values separated by commas. So it's a subtle distinction, but this is how you know when and where to use spread and REST.